The morning Ella Conley dropped to her knees in the red dirt behind her dying farmhouse and begged God Almighty for a sign. She had not expected much. She had been disappointed before. And the Lord, in her experience, had a peculiar sense of humor about timing. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was not a place that offered gentle mercy to a woman alone. The sun came up like a hammer every single morning and beat the earth into submission. And the earth, having no choice in the matter, cracked and split and offered up nothing but dust and the occasional scorpion. Ella had been living on the 40 acres her late husband, Thomas Conley, had purchased with borrowed money 3 years prior, and the farm had never once rewarded either of them with anything resembling prosperity. Thomas had died of a fever in the spring, leaving Ella with 2 mules, a half-repaired barn, a water well that was running shallow, and a debt to the Prescott Valley Land and Savings Company that was due in full by the end of October. It was now the middle of August. She was 26 years old, and she had the hands of a woman twice that age, and she was not the kind of person who wept easily, but that morning she wept. She pressed her palms together in the dirt, and she asked for something, anything that might tell her she was not entirely forgotten by the universe. She asked for a direction. She asked for courage. She asked if it was not too much trouble for some practical assistance, because she was running out of ideas, and the mortgage collector, a man named Gerald Fitch, had made it perfectly clear on his last visit that he was not interested in patience or extensions. She sat back on her heels and wiped her face with the hem of her apron and looked out across the flat, scorched land stretching before her, and she waited. For a long moment there was nothing. Just the dry wind moving through the sparse scrub brush, and the distant sound of her mule, Biscuit, complaining about something in the corral. And then from the south road came a sound. It was the uneven, clomping, lopsided sound of a horse that was not walking right, and Ella shielded her eyes with her hand and squinted into the pale morning glare, and she saw him. He was on a sorrel horse that was clearly favoring its left front leg, picking its way up the road at a pace that could only be described as apologetic. The man on its back was tall even in the saddle, though he was slouched forward in a way that suggested either exhaustion or surrender or both. His hat was brown and battered and tilted at an angle that had not been intentional. His duster coat was the color of the road itself, which was to say it was the color of nothing in particular, a kind of universal trail dust that covered everything and everyone who spent too long in the territory. He had a bedroll strapped behind the saddle and a canteen that looked worryingly flat against his hip, and as he drew closer, Ella could see that his face was sun-darkened and unshaven, and that he was looking at her farmhouse with the expression of a man who was calculating his odds. He stopped at the edge of her property and tipped his ruined hat. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and roughened, like gravel rolling around in a tin cup. "I wonder if I could trouble you for some water, for the horse mainly. She came up lame about 10 miles back, and I've been walking her slow, but she's dry." Ella looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the horse, who had lowered her nose toward the dirt and was blowing tired, dusty breaths. She looked back up at the man, who had the patience to let himself be examined without fidgeting, which she considered a decent sign. She thought about the prayer she had said not 10 minutes ago. She thought about how she had asked for a sign, and this was what had arrived: a dusty cowboy on a lame horse, both of them looking like they had been through something considerably worse than a pleasant morning ride. She decided that would do. "Water's at the trough by the barn," she said, and she stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. "Bring her around." His name was Vernon Graves, and she found that out about 4 minutes after she helped him lead the mare to the water trough and watched them both drink, the horse with desperate, grateful gulps, and the man from the ladle she handed him with a restraint that told her he had practice at not taking too much when it was offered. "Vernon Graves," he said, and held out his hand. His grip was firm but not theatrical about it. "I'm obliged to you, ma'am." "Ella Conley," she said. "You can stop being obliged, it's just water." He looked at her steadily when she said that, and she noticed that his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green, the kind of color that changed depending on what the light was doing. They were serious eyes, watchful, not unkind. "Where are you headed?" she asked, because she was practical and she wanted to understand the situation. "Prescott, eventually," he said. "I had work lined up at a ranch outside of Wickenburg, but that fell through, and I was cutting east when the mare came up lame." He looked down at the horse, who was still drinking steadily. "Her name's Pearl. She's not young, and I pushed her too hard yesterday. That's on me." "What's wrong with the leg?" "Stone bruise, I think. She needs rest, a day, maybe two." Ella looked at him. She looked at Pearl. She looked at her barn, where there was an empty stall that had been empty since her second mule had died in June. She was going to say no. She had been about to say no. She had been preparing a polite and firm refusal that would send Vernon Graves and his lame horse on their way so she could get back to the impossible arithmetic of her situation. Instead, she said, "There's a stall in the barn. It's clean. I could use some fence work done on the north pasture if you're willing to work for the space." He looked at her again with those gray-green eyes, and she had the distinct impression he was a man who thought carefully before speaking. "That's a fair trade," he said. "I'm good with fence work. Are you good with anything else?" A very small, brief thing happened at the corners of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was closer to the acknowledgement that a smile existed and might one day be relevant. "Depends on what needs doing," he said. That was how it started. He was 31 years old. She learned over the course of that first evening, when she fed him supper, because it seemed wrong not to when he had spent 3 hours in the afternoon heat fixing every broken rail on the north fence, without being asked to do more than the section she had pointed to. He had done the whole thing, methodically and without complaint, and when he came to the back porch to wash up at the basin she had set out, the front of his shirt was soaked through, and the dust had settled into every line of his face like fine brown chalk. She had made salt pork and cornbread and the last of her dried beans, and she put it on the table and told him to sit down, and he did, and he ate like a man who had missed several meals without wanting to discuss it. She watched him the way she watched everything, carefully, measuring. He had come from Texas originally, he told her, a small place near the Red River that she had never heard of. His father had run cattle and his grandfather before that, and Vernon had grown up understanding that the world was mostly grass and sky and hard work, and that it did not owe you anything, and that the best thing you could do was keep moving and keep useful. "You have family still?" she asked. "My mother passed when I was young," he said. "Father died 2 winters ago. I've got a younger sister, Clara, who married a shopkeeper in San Antonio. She writes me sometimes when she knows where I am." "Do you know where you are very often?" That small non-smile again. "Not as often as she'd like." Ella thought about what that meant, the life of a man who moved from job to job across the territory, carrying everything he owned on a horse's back, measuring time by the distance between one piece of work and the next. She thought about the loneliness of it, which she suspected was enormous, though he wore it the way some men wore old coats, so used to the weight that they had forgotten it was there. "You've been doing this a long time," she said. It was not a question. "Long enough," he said. He looked down at his plate. "What about you? How long have you been out here alone?" "Since April," she said. "My husband died in April." He looked up at that, not with the awkward, pitying look that most people gave her when she said it. With something quieter and more careful. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, because he had said it like a man who understood that those words were genuinely meant rather than reflexively offered. She told him about Thomas, about the farm, about the debt. She did not know why she told him. It was not her habit to lay out her troubles for strangers. But there was something about Vernon Graves, a quality of stillness, of genuine attention, that made the words come easier than they should have. He listened without interrupting, which was rare. When she had finished, he said, "What's the debt amount?" $340. He was quiet for a moment. "And October is how far?" "About 10 weeks." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, looking at it. "That's a significant problem." I am aware, she said, with a dryness that surprised a laugh out of him, a real one, short and sudden, and she was struck by how it changed his face entirely, the way a window opened in a dark room changes the room. Yes, he said. I expect you are. Pearl's stone bruise needed 3 days of rest, as it turned out, not 2. On the second day, Vernon got up before dawn and had the broken gate on the south paddock repaired before Ella came out to start the morning milking of her one remaining cow, a bad-tempered animal named Cora who had opinions about being touched before the sun was fully up. He had also, she discovered, patched the gap in the barn roof where rain came through, using lumber from the pile behind the building that had been sitting there since Thomas had bought it and never gotten around to using. She stood in the barn doorway with Cora's full bucket in her hand and looked up at the neat patch of new boards against the old weathered roof and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. He was at the water trough brushing Pearl when she came out. You didn't have to do all that, she said. I know, he said, running the brush along Pearl's neck in long, even strokes. I'm a light sleeper, and there's only so much you can do before dawn. She wanted to say something else, something more, but she was not sure what it was, so instead she said, I'll make eggs if you want them. I want them, he said, without looking up from Pearl. On the third day, Pearl was moving better on the leg, and Ella knew that by morning he would be gone, and she found herself in the strange position of having feelings about that which she had not invited and did not entirely understand. She had spent the 3 days noticing things about him that had accumulated quietly, the way snow does, not in any single dramatic moment, but gradually, until you looked up and everything was covered. She had noticed the care he took with Pearl, the way he checked her hoof last thing at night and first thing in the morning. She had noticed the way he read. He had a book in his saddlebag, a worn copy of David Copperfield, and he read in the evenings on the porch steps in the last of the light, with a focus that suggested reading was not a casual activity for him, but something he had chosen deliberately and valued. She had noticed that he was unfailingly polite, but not in the empty way of men who were polite because it was expected, in the way of a man who had thought about it and decided it mattered. She had also noticed, with some alarm, that she had smiled more in the past 3 days than she had in the past 4 months. On the third evening, they sat on the porch after supper, and the Arizona sky performed its usual spectacular show of golds and reds and purples, the kind of sunset that made you feel simultaneously very small and strangely grateful to be alive. And Ella sat in her rocking chair, and Vernon sat on the top porch step with his back against the post, and they were quiet together in the easy way that usually took people much longer to achieve. You'll head out tomorrow, she said. If Pearl's walking clean, yes, he said. He was looking at the sky. The evening light was doing something interesting to his profile. I've still got the Prescott job to look into and a man who might have work in the fall running cattle down near Tucson. That sounds like a full life, she said, meaning it neutrally, but hearing something else in it when it came out. He turned and looked at her. It's a busy life, he said. That's not always the same thing. She held his gaze and she felt the thing in her chest again, more defined this time, like something that had been a blur coming slowly into focus. I need a hand, she said, before she had entirely decided to say it. Not just for the fence work. I mean someone who knows cattle and land who can help me pull this farm into something that can make money before October. I have the land, I have the mules, I have some cattle that I haven't been able to manage properly on my own. I don't have the knowledge or the manpower. She paused. I'd pay you what I can, which is not a great deal, and you'd have the barn, stall, and meals. It's not a generous offer. He studied her for a long moment. She could not read his expression exactly. It was doing several things at once. You're asking me to stay, he said. Not a challenge, just a clarification. I'm offering you work, she said. I need the help. You need a place to land while you figure out the next thing. It's a practical arrangement. The sky deepened from gold to orange to the first deep blue of evening, and somewhere out in the scrub a coyote called once and went quiet. What kind of cattle have you got? He asked. 12 head, mixed. They've been ranging too far north and I haven't been able to bring them in, and the two I can get to are looking thin. Have you got hay put up? Some. Not enough. He looked back at the sky. She could see him thinking, weighing it, and she waited without pressing because she had learned already that he needed his thinking to be complete before he could speak. "All right," he said finally. "I'll stay through October at minimum. We get the cattle sorted, we figure out the money situation, and we see where things are." She breathed out slowly. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, still looking at the sky. "Don't thank me yet. 12 scattered cattle in August heat is not a pleasant business." "Nothing about this is pleasant," she said. "No," he agreed. And then the corners of his mouth did the thing again, that preliminary gesture toward a smile. And this time it completed itself, brief and real and warm, and Ella looked away at the darkening horizon before she could be caught staring. The weeks that followed were the hardest and also the most unexpectedly alive that Ella had felt in a very long time. They rose before dawn every day without discussing it. It was simply the rhythm that the work required, and they both understood work's rhythms. Vernon had a directness about labor that she respected deeply. He did not make speeches about what needed doing. He assessed, he planned quietly, and then he did the thing. He had rounded up 9 of the 12 scattered cattle by the end of the first week, running them back into the south pasture with a patience and skill that made it look easier than it was. The remaining 3 had drifted onto the land belonging to a rancher named Harlan Price, who occupied the large property to the north, and who had made no secret of his belief that Ella's farm would default, and that he intended to purchase the land when it did. Vernon rode up to Price's spread on a Tuesday morning and came back in the early afternoon with all 3 cattle and a look on his face that told Ella the conversation had not been pleasant. He tried to claim they were his, Vernon said, unsaddling Pearl in the barn with economical movements. "They are clearly marked," Ella said. She had branded them herself after Thomas died, a small C inside a circle on the left hip. "I pointed that out," Vernon said. He set Pearl's saddle on the rack and turned to look at Ella. "He's not a good man, Ella." It was the first time he had used her name without the ma'am, and they both noticed it, though neither said anything about it. "I know he isn't," she said. "He offered to buy this land for half its value the month after Thomas died. He came to the funeral wearing a satisfied expression." Something flickered in Vernon's eyes that she recognized, a controlled kind of anger, steady and contained. "He said something about the debt," Vernon said carefully, "about knowing the man at the land office." Ella felt her stomach drop. "What did he say exactly?" "That a friend of his might be expediting the collection process, that sometimes these things moved faster than expected." She sat down on a hay bale. "Gerald Fitch," she said, "the mortgage collector. Fitch and Price are friends." Vernon leaned against the stall post and looked at her. "Tell me everything you know about the debt, the actual paperwork," she told him. The original loan had been through the Prescott Valley Land and Savings Company, and the terms had been clear enough: 3 years at a fixed interest rate, with the balloon payment due in October. Thomas had made 2 payments before he died. Ella had scraped together a 3rd payment in June, which had depleted nearly all of her cash savings. The remaining amount was $340. "The terms," Vernon said slowly. "Do you have the paperwork?" "Yes, in the strong box." "Get it." She brought the papers out, and he sat at the kitchen table in the last of the afternoon light and read them with the focused attention she had come to associate with him, not quickly, but thoroughly, turning pages back to reread sections, tracing lines with his finger. "There's a grace provision," he said. She leaned over his shoulder to look. He pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the 2nd page, dense with the small, careful handwriting of whoever had drawn up the contract. "If the borrower provides written notice of intent to pay in full within 90 days of the due date, the company is required to grant a 30-day extension before any collection action can proceed," he read aloud. Ella stared at it. "Thomas never mentioned that." "He may not have read it this carefully," Vernon said. "When did Fitch last come by?" 3 weeks ago. Did he mention the extension provision? No. Vernon set the paper down. He had a very particular look on his face, not angry exactly, but the look of a man who had identified a wrong thing and was now quietly determining what to do about it. You need to send written notice, he said, to the land company, not to Fitch, directly to their Prescott office. It needs to be dated and witnessed. That buys me another month, she said. October becomes November. I still need $340. Yes, he said, but it gives us more time to earn it. She was quiet for a moment. You said us, she said. He looked up. I did, he said simply. That evening they sat at the table after supper and worked out the numbers together by lamplight. Ella had not done this with anyone since Thomas, and there was something both painful and deeply comforting about the shared arithmetic of survival. The way two people leaning over the same figures created a kind of intimacy that was not romantic exactly, but was not purely practical either. They could sell 6 of the cattle, Vernon said, and still maintain a viable herd going into winter. At current market prices in Prescott, that was approximately $120, maybe $140 if the animals came in good weight. They could sell the second mule, Clarence, who was old and worked poorly and eating feed he was not earning. Another $20 perhaps. Ella had been weaving blankets through the winter and spring, a skill her mother had taught her, and there was a dry goods store in the nearby town of Red Mesa that had agreed to take them on consignment. Vernon thought they could push that output harder. I can weave, she said, but I cannot weave $180 worth of blankets in 3 months. No, he agreed. But between the cattle, the mule, and the blankets, we're looking at maybe $170, $180. That's still $160 short. He was quiet. He turned his coffee cup. He had a habit, she had noticed, of thinking with his hands occupied, as if the small circular motion of the cup helped some internal process along. There's a cattle drive coming through from New Mexico territory, he said. I heard about it from a drover I worked with 2 years ago, a man named Hollis Bream. He runs contract drives, transporting other people's cattle to the rail stockyards in Phoenix. He pays the hands fair wages, and he's always looking for experienced riders. You're talking about going on a cattle drive, she said. For 6 weeks in September and October, the pay is $50 a month. She looked at him. That would close the gap. More or less, yes. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she did not want him to go, which was a thought she had no right to be having, given that Vernon Graves had no obligation to her beyond what he had agreed to, which was work through October. She did not say it because it would have been unfair, and also because she was not entirely sure it was only practical concern, that it might be something else, something warmer and more frightening, and she was not ready to examine that yet. Send the notice to the land company first, she said, and let's get the cattle to wait. He looked at her steadily. We'll figure it out, he said. It was a quiet sentence, not dramatic, but the way he said it with a calm certainty that felt like a hand placed gently on a shaking table, undid something in her that she had been holding together for a long time. She nodded and looked down at the papers. The letter went to Prescott by the next mail rider, witnessed and dated, and for a few days after that, Ella felt the relief of having bought time settling over her like a cooler season. Gerald Fitch showed up on a Thursday afternoon, and he did not look pleased. He was a round-shouldered man with a mustache that he groomed more carefully than the rest of him, and he had a way of looking at Ella's farm with the expression of a man pricing furniture at an auction. He tied his horse at the post and came up the front walk with the particular walk of a man who believed his presence was a significant event. Vernon was in the paddock working with the cattle when Fitch arrived, and by the time Ella had come out onto the porch, Vernon had drifted, apparently casually, to the fence nearest the front of the property, close enough to hear without making a display of it. Mrs. Conley, Fitch said, pulling out a folded paper. I want to talk to you about this notice you sent. Good afternoon, Mr. Fitch, she said pleasantly, As you can see from the notice, I've invoked the extension provision in the original loan agreement. Now, that provision is typically for borrowers providing written notice of intent to pay within 90 days of the due date, she said, having memorized the exact language. Which I have done. In accordance with the contract terms, the company is required to grant a 30-day extension. Fitch's mustache moved. Mrs. Conley, in my experience, women in your situation are better served by accepting. My situation, she said, is that I have legal rights under a signed contract and I intend to exercise them. Is there anything else I can help you with today? There was a silence. Fitch looked past her toward the paddock, where Vernon had stilled entirely, one arm resting on the fence rail, watching the exchange with gray-green eyes that held approximately the emotional temperature of still water over stone. Something in Fitch's assessment shifted when he registered Vernon. "You've hired a hand," Fitch said. "I have," Ella said. "We've been productive." Fitch folded his paper back up with a deliberateness that was meant to communicate something. "I'll be back in November, Mrs. Conley." "I'll have your money in November," she said. He rode away and Ella stood on the porch and watched him go, and Vernon came up from the paddock and they stood there together watching the dust settle behind Fitch's horse. "You were magnificent," Vernon said. She turned and looked at him, surprised by the word, by the directness of it. "I knew the contract," she said. "Yes," he said. "You knew the contract and you weren't afraid of him. That matters." She felt warmth move up into her face that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat, and she turned away before he could see it. "We need to get Clarence sorted for sale," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she heard the almost smile in his voice and did not trust herself to turn around and look at it. Red Mesa was a small town, a main street with a hotel, a general store, a blacksmith, a feed store, a saloon, and a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse 3 days a week. The town marshal was a man named Abel Cord, who had held the position for 7 years and was widely regarded as both fair and tired in equal measure. Ella went to town once a week for supplies and to drop off the blankets at Macready's Dry Goods, and she had been going alone since Thomas died. The first time she went with Vernon, she noticed things she had not particularly noticed before. The way the men at the saloon porch watched her differently when she was accompanied, with a more careful restraint that she found simultaneously reassuring and infuriating. She had been managing perfectly well alone. She had not required a male presence to legitimize her errands. And yet the plain fact was that, with Vernon walking beside her, people left her alone in a way they had not done when she came in by herself, and she could not pretend the practicality of that was not real. At Macready's, the storekeeper examined the new stack of blankets she had brought and calculated the credit for the ones that had sold. $14, Macready said. The Navajo pattern ones went first. I could sell twice as many of those. I'll make more of the pattern, Ella said. Outside, she and Vernon stood in the heat on the wooden boardwalk, and she was calculating the running total in her head, $14 here, the cattle coming to wait, Clarence's sale pending, when a woman's voice said her name. She turned to find Martha Holt, who was one of the few women in Red Mesa who had been consistently kind to Ella since Thomas died. Martha was 40-something and practical and had brought food to the farmhouse twice in the first month and asked no questions and required no performance of grief, which Ella had valued enormously. "Ella," Martha said, and then looked at Vernon with a frank and open curiosity that was not unkind. "And who is this?" "Vernon Graves," Vernon said, and tipped his hat. "I've been doing some work on Mrs. Conley's property." Martha looked at Ella with an expression that Ella recognized, the look of a woman who was seeing something and filing it away with great interest. "Well," Martha said cheerfully, "it's good to see you with some help, Ella. You've been working yourself to bone and shadow since the spring." She fixed Vernon with a direct gaze. "You're treating her right, Martha," Ella said. "I'm asking," Martha said serenely, "because she doesn't have a father or a brother to ask it, and somebody should." Vernon met Martha's gaze without flinching. "I'm trying to," he said. There was a quiet sincerity in it that made Ella feel the warmth again, that unsteady warmth that she was increasingly unable to attribute to weather. Martha seemed satisfied. She patted Ella's arm. "Come to supper Sunday," she said. "Both of you." And she sailed on down the boardwalk as if she had not just rearranged several things. The supper at the Holt household that Sunday was the first time Ella had sat at a real social table since Thomas's funeral, and she had not realized how starved she had been for it. The ordinary warmth of other people gathered around food and conversation. Martha's husband, Sam Holt, ran the feed store and had the broad, quiet decency of a man who had understood early in life that good listening was more valuable than good talking. Their son Jimmy was 15 and awkward and stared at the tablecloth. Their daughter Bess was 12 and asked Vernon 17 questions about horses in rapid succession, and he answered every one of them with the same careful attention he gave to everything. Watching him across the table in the Holt's lamplight, easy in the chair, talking with Sam about water rights and the territorial drought, making Bess laugh with a story about a horse he had once worked with in Texas that had a personal vendetta against hats. Ella had a sudden, clear, and rather alarming thought. She was falling in love with him. Not gently or gradually in the way she had imagined love might work. Not the slow, settled, warm comfort of it, but hard and fast and entirely inconveniently. The way you fell when the ground gave way without warning, and you found yourself already in the air before you understood what was happening. She picked up her water glass and set it down and looked at her plate and told herself very firmly that this was not the moment to be having that realization, that she had a farm to save and a debt to pay and several hundred other priorities that ranked above the state of her heart. She looked up and found Vernon looking at her across the table, and he had the look of a man who had been watching her for a moment before she caught him at it, and for a single arrested second they looked at each other with all the careful distance stripped away, and she understood with perfect certainty that whatever was happening, it was not one-directional. Then Martha said something funny and the moment broke, and they both looked away and the supper continued. On the ride home in the dark, Vernon on Pearl, Ella on the wagon seat with old Biscuit pulling slow and easy, the desert was cool and vast and full of stars, and the silence between them was different from their usual comfortable quiet. It had something waiting inside it. "Martha likes you," Ella said finally. "I like her," he said. Pearl walked alongside the wagon at a gentle pace, her lameness long since resolved, her stride steady. "She's good people." "She is," Ella agreed. Then, because she was a direct woman and avoidance was not her natural mode, she said, "She was checking on me." "I know," he said. "She worries about people taking advantage," Ella said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable thing to worry about," he said, "given the circumstances." She glanced at him. He was looking at the road ahead, his profile clean against the dark sky. "Are you," she asked, "taking advantage?" He turned to look at her. His expression was very serious. "No," he said, "I am not." A pause. "And I want to be clear about something, if I may." "Go ahead," she said. "I took this work because you needed help and I needed a place to be useful," he said. "That's how it started, but that's not." He stopped. He was doing the thing where he needed his thinking to be complete. She waited. "I'm not going to say something that would put you in a difficult position," he said finally, "when you have enough difficult things to manage already. But I want you to know that my staying and my working isn't about the convenience. It hasn't been about that for a while." Ella looked at the road between Biscuit's dark ears. "The stars were extraordinary tonight, a whole river of them." "I know," she said. Her voice was very steady. "I know that, Vernon." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was the different kind of silence now. The kind that is full rather than empty. The kind that is warm rather than cool. The kind that holds something that both people can feel but have not yet found the exact right words for. September came and the heat broke slightly, or at least it pretended to, offering a few mornings that felt almost gentle before the afternoon built back into its familiar brutal intensity. The work intensified with the season cutting hay, preparing the cattle, making the rounds of the water sources to make sure none had gone fully dry. Vernon had contacted Holly's Bream about the cattle drive, and Bream had confirmed there was work, starting in the second week of September, running through mid-October. The pay would cover exactly the gap in the debt. Ella had done the math 6 times, and it always came out to within a few dollars either way of what they needed. He told her he was going on a Monday morning, standing in the barn while she milked Cora. "It's the right thing to do," she said, not looking up from the work. "It is," he said. "I want you to keep the shotgun inside, not in the barn." She looked up at that. "I've been managing alone for months." "I know you have," he said. I want to know you have it close." She read the concern in his face and accepted it for what it was, which was not condescension but care, which were two things she had enough experience of both to tell apart clearly. "I'll keep it inside," she said. He left 3 days later in the early morning before full light. He had Pearl saddled and his bedroll packed, and his supply kit sorted with the organized efficiency she had come to expect from him. She stood on the porch and he stood by Pearl, and there was a moment of suspended time in which neither of them quite knew what form the goodbye should take. "I'll be back before the 1st of November," he said. "I'll have the blankets finished and the money ready," she said. "Write to me if anything happens with Fitch or Price," he said. "Bream has a contact at the postal station in Phoenix. The address is on the paper I left you." "I have it," she said. He put his foot in the stirrup. He stopped. He turned back and looked at her across the short distance of the yard with those gray-green eyes in the early morning light. "Ella," he said. "I know," she said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then he swung up into the saddle and rode south, and she stood on the porch until the dust from Pearl's hooves had dissolved into the brightening air, and then she went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment doing absolutely nothing, and then she picked up the weaving frame and got back to work. The weeks that followed had a particular quality to them, the quality of waiting, which Ella had always found more exhausting than action, because at least with action you were using your hands. She wove. She tended the cattle. She managed the repairs that came up, mending what she could and noting what she could not. She visited Martha on Sundays, and Martha asked carefully worded questions, and Ella gave carefully worded answers, and they were both quite aware of the conversation happening beneath the one they were actually having. Harlan Price came by once, in the second week of September, with a new offer for the land. It was higher than the first offer but still below what the land was worth, and he delivered it with the expression of a man doing her a tremendous favor. "The help you hired has gone," Price observed, looking around the empty property with barely concealed satisfaction. "He'll be back," Ella said. "These drifters, Mrs. Conley, they don't come back," Price said, with the particular confidence of a man who had decided he knew how the story ended. "He will be back," she said again, with a certainty that surprised even herself. "And in November I will have the full payment for the land company, and this conversation will be unnecessary. Good afternoon, Mr. Price." She went inside and stood very still until she heard his horse leave the property. 2 letters arrived from Vernon over the course of October. They were not long letters, not the elaborate, flowery letters of a man who was performing feeling for an audience. They were practical letters with a current at their core. He wrote about the cattle drive, the miles covered, the difficult passages through dry country. He wrote about the other hands, about Holly's Bream's management style, about a thunderstorm that had scattered the herd one night and the 12 hours that had followed recovering it. He wrote, near the end of the second letter, one sentence that was not practical at all. "The thing I am most looking forward to is the porch at your place in the evening," he wrote. "I did not know I was looking for something like that until I found it." Ella read that sentence 4 times. She pressed the letter flat on the kitchen table and looked at it and felt the full, honest, unflinching weight of what she felt, which was considerable and which she was no longer interested in arguing with. She wrote back. She wrote about the farm, about Cora's continued bad temperament, about the blankets, about Price's visit. At the end, she wrote, The porch is the same and so is the view. Come home safe." She addressed it to the Phoenix postal contact and sent it with the next rider. He came back on the 28th of October, 4 days before November and 3 days before the extended debt deadline. She heard Pearl's hooves on the road and she stepped out onto the porch. And there he was, dusty from the road, tired from 6 weeks of hard work, taller somehow, or maybe she had just missed him enough to make the sight of him seem larger than ordinary scale. He rode into the yard and dismounted, and for a moment they just looked at each other across 10 feet of packed earth, and then Ella stepped down off the porch and walked toward him, and he was already walking toward her, and they met in the middle of the yard and he took both of her hands in his. "You're all right," he said. It was said with a relief that went considerably deeper than professional concern. "I'm all right," she said. "I made the blankets. I sold Clarence for $22. I have most of what we need, and with your wages, we have enough," he said. He was still holding her hands. "I did the math on the road." "I've been doing it too," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The evening sun was coming in low and warm, and everything was lit golden and soft. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need to know if I should say it." "Say it," she said. "I've been moving from one piece of work to the next for 10 years, he said, "and in all that time I never found a place I wanted to stay. I found you, I found this place, and I have not for one single day of the past 6 weeks wanted to be anywhere else." He paused. He was holding her gaze with that steady, careful attention she had come to trust with everything. "I'm not asking anything of you that isn't freely given," he said. "You've had loss and you've had hard months, and I won't press for something you're not ready for, but I want you to know what I want if you're willing to hear it." "I'm willing," she said softly. "I want to stay," he said, "not as a hired hand. I want to build something here with you if you'll have me. I want the porch in the evenings and the quiet mornings and the hard work of it and the difficult arithmetic of it. I want all of it." He tightened his grip gently on her hands. "I want you, Ella. That's what I'm saying." The Arizona evening light moved across everything, the barn, the scrub, the pale dusty road, the face of the man standing in front of her holding her hands, and Ella Conley, who had knelt in the dirt behind her house in August and asked the universe for a sign and received a dusty cowboy on a lame horse, and decided that would do, understood now with magnificent clarity that the universe had, in fact, known exactly what it was doing. "I want that too," she said. "I've wanted it for some time." He stepped forward and she stepped forward, and he let go of her hands only to put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder and breathed him in trail dust and horse and wood smoke and the particular warmth of him. And his arms were careful and strong, and neither of them said anything for a long moment because nothing needed saying. When he pulled back to look at her, his eyes were doing several things at once: relief and joy, and a quieter, more private thing that she thought she recognized as the expression of a man who has spent a long time being lonely and has arrived, without quite being prepared for it, at the end of that particular journey. He kissed her gently, with a care that matched everything else about him, and the desert held very still around them. The payment of the debt was, in its own particular way, one of the more satisfying mornings of Ella's life. She and Vernon rode into Prescott together, a 2-day ride, staying overnight at a traveler's inn, sleeping in separate rooms with a propriety they both maintained with only slight strain, and they went to the offices of the Prescott Valley Land and Savings Company directly and asked to speak with the manager, a thin man named Abner Caldwell, who looked at them with the wariness of a man expecting trouble. Ella counted out the money herself, $340 in a combination of cattle sale funds, mule sale funds, blanket proceeds, and Vernon's cattle drive wages, and she set it on the desk in stacks, and she did not look away from Caldwell's face as he counted it. "Full payment," she said. "I will require a written receipt dated today and a release of lien on the property, the full paperwork." Caldwell looked at the money. He looked at her. He looked briefly at Vernon, who was standing to her left with his hat in his hands and the composed expression of a man who was in no hurry whatsoever. Of course, Mrs. Conley, Caldwell said. The paperwork took 40 minutes. They waited. The receipt and the release were drawn up and signed and stamped and handed over, and Ella folded them carefully and put them inside her coat. "Mr. Fitch will be informed," she said. "He will," Caldwell said. "Good," she said. "Good afternoon." On the street outside, in the bright October Prescott sunlight, Vernon looked at her with that slow, complete smile, the full one, the real one, and she felt it move through her from the center outward. "Congratulations," he said. "We," she said. "Congratulations to us." He took her hand as they walked to the hotel for dinner, and it was such a natural, unconsidered thing, the reaching and the taking, that she almost missed the significance of it. The way two people who have found each other begin to move through the world differently, as a unit, as something coherent. The ride home was easier than the ride out, because the thing that had been uncertain was now settled, and there was room for lightness. They talked more freely than they had before, or rather, the conversation went places it had circled around previously. He told her about his childhood in Texas, the good parts of it, the horses his father had kept, a bay stallion named Governor who had been the most willful animal he had ever encountered, the summer evenings sitting on the fence rails watching the river. She told him about her own childhood in Missouri, her mother's weaving, her father's patience, the way she had always known she wanted land of her own even when she was very small, had always felt the pull of it, the deep sense that rootedness was not a limitation but a kind of freedom. "We are not so different," he said, at one point. "We came to the same place by different roads," she said. "That happens," he said. "Sometimes the roads know more than the people on them." She thought about Pearl's stone bruise, which had slowed Vernon to the pace at which the South Road ran past her farm at exactly the moment she had been kneeling in the dirt behind the house. She thought about the precise improbability of it, his lame horse, her prayer, the universe's peculiar, dusty, unglamorous response to her request for a sign. She laughed, and when he asked her what was funny, she told him, and he laughed too, and it was a good sound on the open road, genuine and large. "I was not exactly the answer you were hoping for," he said. "You were exactly what I needed," she said. "That is not always the same thing as what you hope for, and it is generally considerably better." He looked at her with an expression she had been cataloging for months and now understood fully, the expression of a man who could not quite believe his luck and was not going to waste it. When they got back to the farm in the late afternoon of the second day, the place looked different to her, or she was different, or both. The barn was solid, the fence lines were straight, the cattle were in the south pasture, and the house sat low and warm-colored in the late autumn light, and it was hers. Legitimately, legally, fully hers. She stood on the porch and breathed deeply, and Vernon stood beside her, and they looked at the land together. "It needs work," she said. "Everything does," he said. "That's fine." In November, they discussed the practical question of what the future should look like with the directness that had come to characterize everything between them, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and a list. "I think we should be married," Vernon said, with the same tone he had used to say, "I think we should bring the cattle in from the north pasture, matter of fact and sincere, without decoration." Ella considered this. She was not opposed to the idea. She had, if she was being entirely honest, been expecting something like this conversation for several weeks, and she had done her own thinking about it. "I have conditions," she said. "Of course you do," he said, and the smile did not hide itself. "The land stays in both our names. I'm not interested in having it fold back into only your name by legal default. In this territory, a married woman's property goes to her husband, and I need us to be clear that this land is mine as much as yours." "Agreed entirely," he said. "I'll sign whatever needs signing." "And if things go badly for us," she continued, with the practical thoroughness that he had come to deeply respect, "we part fairly. I'm not interested in a marriage that becomes a trap." He looked at her steadily. "Ella," he said, "I'm not going to leave you. That's not a promise I'm making lightly or because I feel obligated to. It's what I know about myself." "I know that," she said. "I still want the agreement." "Then you have it," he said. "What else?" "That's all," she said. "Those were the serious ones." He leaned forward across the table. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Do you want to marry me? Not the farm arrangement, not the practical question of it. Do you want to?" She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the face she had been reading for 3 months and had not yet finished learning, at the eyes that were looking at her with all the warmth and steadiness and genuineness she had come to rely on like weather and water. "Yes," she said, "very much." The wedding happened on the 14th of December, 1878, in the small Red Mesa church conducted by the circuit preacher, a cheerful man named Reverend Amos Birch, who came through every 6 weeks and had a talent for brevity. Martha Holt stood with Ella. Sam Holt stood with Vernon. The whole town appeared to come, or at least the part of the town that had been paying attention, which was most of it. Ella wore her best blue dress and her mother's silver brooch. Vernon wore a clean shirt and new suspenders and had his hair combed, which Ella found almost unbearably endearing. He had shined his boots. When Reverend Birch asked if she would take Vernon Graves as her husband, she said yes in a clear voice and looked directly at Vernon as she said it, and he looked back at her with an expression that she thought she would be able to close her eyes and see for the rest of her life. He took her hand when Birch pronounced them married, and she squeezed his fingers, and he squeezed back. Martha cried, which she denied immediately and firmly and entirely without credibility. The celebration afterward was at the Holt's house, which Martha had filled with food and people and a warmth that pushed back the December cold, and Ella moved through it in a state of sustained, quiet joy, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but sits deep, like good soil. Late in the evening, she and Vernon slipped out to the porch for some air, and they stood in the cold December dark, and she leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her. "Married," he said, with a note of wonder. "You expected otherwise," she said. "I expected very little when I rode up that road in August," he said. "I was looking for water." She tilted her head up to look at him. "And what did you find?" He looked down at her. The light from the Holt's windows fell warm and golden across the porch. "Everything," he said. They went home to their home through the cold December night with a lantern on the wagon and the stars blazing overhead, and Pearl walking behind at a slow and contented pace. Winter was its own education. The territory could be brutal in winter, the nights dropping hard and the wind finding every gap in every wall, and they spent the cold months in a state of ongoing domestic industry, mending and improving and building, making the house into something that could be lived in through all seasons rather than just survived. Vernon was good with a plane and a hammer, a fact Ella had known from the fence work, but which became much more useful when applied to the interior of a house. He rehung every door that had been hanging wrong. He built a better shelf in the pantry. He split enough wood in November to see them through February, and then split more when February proved worse than expected. Ella continued her weaving with increased production, having found that Macready's in Red Mesa was not the only market available to her. A general store in Prescott had sent word, through a contact Martha knew, that they would take blankets and quilts at a reasonable price. She was earning steady small money that went directly into a tin box on the kitchen shelf, which she had designated for farm improvements. She was also learning to be married, which was both simpler and more complex than she had expected. Simpler because Vernon was not a difficult man to live with. He was tidy and considerate, and he communicated clearly, and he did not believe that his comfort took precedence over hers, which was not universal among the men of her acquaintance. More complex because real intimacy, the genuine kind, the kind that required you to let another person see you thoroughly, was always more complex than its theoretical form. There were adjustments. He had a habit of staying up late that she did not share. She had a tendency to solve problems alone and internally before speaking about them, which he found frustrating, not because he needed to be involved in everything, but because he wanted her to know she could bring him things. They learned each other's rhythms the way people learn difficult songs, by playing them wrong first, and then more right, until the music started to come natural. In February, she told him she thought she might be expecting. She said it on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup, and he had gone very still in the way he went still when he was feeling something large. "Are you sure?" he said. "Not entirely," she said, "but I think so." He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside hers and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, a kind of luminous fractured wonder that was not something he had been in the habit of showing before her, and which he showed now only because she was her. "Are you well?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said honestly. "A bit uncertain, mostly good." He took her hand. He was quiet for a long moment. "We'll need to get the east room cleared out properly," he said finally, because he was also a practical man, and he expressed love through the language of useful doing. "And the roof over that side has been something I've been meaning to." "Vernon," she said. "Yes. Be happy first, fix the roof later." He looked at her, and the expression on his face went clear and full and unmixed with calculation, and he said, I am impossibly happy." And he pressed his forehead to her hand, and she felt the warmth of that moving through her like spring light. Martha, when told, said she had suspected since January, which was the kind of thing Martha said, and which may or may not have been true, and which Ella did not feel strongly about either way because Martha's joy for them was so obviously genuine that the editorial claims about her own predictive powers were easy to forgive. Spring came. The farm, with winter's work behind it, looked different than it had looked in August of the previous year, tighter, neater, more purposeful. The cattle had come through winter in good condition. The north pasture, which had been overgrazed and dry, had been rested and reseeded with a mix Vernon had researched in a farming almanac, and was showing the first green growth of the season. The garden behind the house, which Ella had let go fallow in her grief and exhaustion, had been turned and planted, and the first rows of beans and squash and corn were pushing up through the dark soil. Harlan Price had made one more attempt in January to make a claim that 3 of the cattle still in the south pasture were his, an argument so transparently unsupported by evidence that Marshal Abel Cord had dismissed it in under 20 minutes and told Price to stop wasting everybody's time. The look on Price's face when he rode away had the particular quality of a man who has understood that the thing he was counting on is not going to happen. Ella watched him go from the porch window and felt not triumph exactly, but something cleaner. The simple, solid satisfaction of a problem that had been solved. In May, she received a letter from Gerald Fitch, not a threatening letter, nothing about the debt, which was settled and done, but a stiffly worded note informing her that he was relocating his operation to Flagstaff and would no longer be associated with the Prescott Valley Land and Savings Company. She read it twice, set it down, and felt the last of that particular shadow lift. The baby came in November, a boy, strong-lunged and impatient, arriving in the early morning hours while the wind moved dry and cold outside the window, and Vernon sat in the chair beside the bed holding Ella's hand with a grip that was steadier than it had any right to be, given the look on his face. The midwife, a competent woman named Dorothea Park, who came from the neighboring town and had done this many hundreds of times, handed the baby to Ella and said he was healthy and sizable, and declared herself satisfied with the proceedings, and left them alone together with the new, extraordinary fact of their son. He was red-faced and suspicious of everything, the way new babies are, and he had a tuft of dark hair that stood up in an impractical direction, and he had Vernon's long fingers and Ella's chin, and they both looked at him for a long time in silence. "What's his name?" Vernon said. His voice was different. It had never sounded quite like this before, scraped open, low and wondering. They had discussed names. They had a list. But now that the boy was here, actual and warm and breathing with fierce independence, the list felt like something that had belonged to a different conversation. "Thomas," Ella said, and looked up at Vernon. He met her eyes. He knew what she was doing, not holding the past over the present, not creating confusion between one Thomas and another, but honoring what had been without letting it define what was. Thomas Conley had been her first husband, and he had deserved better from the world than it gave him, and this was a way of saying she remembered that. Vernon nodded. "Thomas," he said, "Thomas Vernon Graves." "You don't mind," she said. "I don't mind," he said. He reached out and touched the baby's hand with one careful finger, and the baby wrapped his own fingers around it with the automatic, fierce grip of the newly arrived. Vernon's face did something it was never going to do where anyone but she could see it. "Hello," he said quietly to his son. "I'm glad you're here." The years that came after had the texture of real life, which is to say they were full of difficulty and joy and work and surprise in proportions that did not always distribute fairly, but that averaged over time into something that could only be described as deeply good. The farm grew. In the second year they purchased 10 more head of cattle, a young bull who turned out to have a fine, even temperament, and an additional 40 acres on the eastern side that became available when the previous owner relocated to California. The house was extended in the third year. Vernon spent the summer building a new bedroom off the back and replacing the old porch boards and adding a covered section over the wash basin. They had a second child when Thomas was 3, another boy, born in January, who they named Eli after Vernon's grandfather, and who arrived at dawn and immediately demonstrated that he intended to be louder and more energetic than his older brother, a declaration of intent he maintained consistently for the next several years. Thomas, who had inherited a combination of Ella's practicality and Vernon's quietness, spent a great deal of the first months of his brother's life regarding Eli with a philosophical expression, as though he had assessed the situation and arrived at a conditional peace with it. Clara, Vernon's sister in San Antonio, wrote a letter when she heard about the children, a warm, long letter full of exclamation points and gentle teasing of her brother for having taken so long to settle, and a genuine warmth for Ella that came through even in ink. She said she would come to visit when the season allowed. She came in the autumn of the following year, and she and Ella liked each other immediately. The way two direct, capable women sometimes recognize each other across a table and understand they are in the presence of a kindred arrangement with the world. Clara's husband, Daniel, came with her, a quiet man with a sense of humor that emerged sideways and surprised you, and he and Vernon spent 3 evenings on the porch talking about everything and nothing with the ease of men who have each found their place and are not in competition. "She is exactly right for you," Clara said to her brother privately on the last evening of the visit. "I know," Vernon said, with a simplicity that satisfied his sister completely. Red Mesa changed around them over the following years, as the territory was changing everywhere. More settlers, more roads, more commerce, the slow and sometimes contentious process of civilization arriving with all its benefits and its costs. The Apache had been pushed from much of the territory through force and injustice that Ella found deeply troubling, and she said so openly, which was not universal among the settlers, and which earned her both respect from some quarters and disapproval from others. Vernon shared her feeling about it without qualification. He had worked alongside Apache men on a drive in his earlier years and had no patience for the flat dehumanization that many settlers performed so casually. "This land was theirs before any of us drew a property line on it," he said once to a neighbor who had made a dismissive comment. That is not a complicated truth, even if it is an inconvenient one. The neighbor had not been pleased, and Ella had been proud of him in a way that settled deep and warm. Thomas grew into a boy who read everything he could get hold of, who helped with the cattle without being asked, who had a particular gift with horses that seemed almost communicative. The ability to stand with an animal and somehow arrive at an understanding that bypassed the usual process of training. He reminded Ella of his father, which was a thing she said to Vernon once on the porch after the boys were in bed, and Vernon had been quiet for a moment and then said, "He reminds me of you mostly," which Ella thought was the more accurate observation. Eli grew into a boy who was loud and enthusiastic and deeply affectionate, and who had an inexhaustible curiosity about the mechanics of everything: how fences were built, how water moved through soil, how to read the weather from the clouds. He asked questions at a rate that made you tired just thinking about it, and he rarely waited for the full answer before asking the next thing. "He's going to be a builder," Vernon predicted, watching 5-year-old Eli attempting to construct a miniature fence out of sticks near the barn. "He's going to be something spectacular and exhausting," Ella said, with enormous fondness. There was a third child, a girl born when Eli was 4, in the last of the summer, Margaret, after Ella's mother, who had died when Ella was 20. She had Ella's dark hair and Vernon's eyes and an expression of complete serenity from the first day, as though she had arrived fully resolved about the terms of her presence. Thomas was 7 by then, and treated his new sister with a grave and careful attentiveness that made everyone's chest ache pleasantly. Eli promptly began teaching her things she could not yet use, which was the highest compliment he knew how to pay. The farm, by this point, had become something that neither of them had clearly imagined that August morning when Ella had handed a stranger a ladle of water for his lame horse. It was not a large operation. They were not wealthy people, would not be, but it was solid and working, and theirs. The cattle herd had stabilized at a productive size. The blanket weaving had expanded into a small but consistent business that Ella ran with increasing organization, eventually bringing in 2 of the neighboring women to help with production and splitting the proceeds fairly, which gave those women an income of their own that mattered to them considerably. Vernon had become a settled figure in Red Mesa over the years, a man people came to when something needed doing, when a fence dispute needed a fair eye, when a horse needed a knowledgeable opinion. He was not a man who sought visibility, but he was a man who could be trusted, and in a small western town in the latter years of the 19th century, that was its own form of standing. He was in his late 30s by the time the children were growing properly, and the road and the trail dust and the rootless movement of his earlier years had settled out of him, as dust settles when there is no more wind moving. He was not a different man. He was the same man, with the same quietness and the same steadiness and the same careful attention to everything, but he wore his life differently now. He wore it like a man who had arrived somewhere. On an evening in October, 10 years after the day Ella had stood in her yard and watched him ride up the south road on a limping horse, they sat on the porch after supper, the 3 children inside, Thomas doing his reading, Eli building something mysterious out of wood scraps, Margaret already asleep with the serene efficiency that characterized everything she did. The desert evening was doing what it always did, going from gold to orange to the deep particular blue of night, and the stars were assembling themselves slowly in the cooling sky. Ella was in the rocking chair with a cup of tea that had gone mostly cold, which she did not mind. Vernon was on the porch step with his back against the post, which was where he always was. It occurred to her, sitting there, that there were things she wanted to say. She set down the cup. She looked at the back of his head, at the silver that had started threading through the dark hair at his temples, at the familiar set of his shoulders. "Vernon," he turned. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Go ahead," he said, with the patience that had never changed. "The morning I prayed in the dirt behind this house," she said, "I was asking for almost anything. I was desperate and frightened and very tired, and I was not asking for much. I was asking for a direction. And you came up the road on a lame horse." He waited, watching her. "I decided at the time that you would do," she said. "That was how I thought about it, practical, provisional, the universe's very minimum response to a sincere request. And I was right that the horse was lame and you were dusty, and that neither of you were particularly impressive in that first moment. I appreciate your honesty," he said. "But I want to say," she continued, and her voice had changed slightly, gone softer, more careful, the way her voice went when she was speaking about something that mattered to the center of her, That I have understood for a long time, and I understand now more than ever, that what came up that road that morning was not the universe's minimum. It was not settling. It was not almost anything. She paused. It was the right answer, the exact right one. And I am grateful every single day that Pearl stepped on a stone. He looked at her. In the last light of the evening, his eyes were doing all their things at once, the gray and the green and the warmth and the steadiness. He got up from the step and came to her and crouched beside the rocking chair, his hands on the armrests, his face level with hers. "Ella," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I just wanted to say it properly." He reached up and touched her face with his hand gently as if she were something he wanted to get right. "I've been trying to say it back," he said, "since approximately August of 1878. I'm not much of a talker, as you may have noticed." "I've noticed," she said. "So let me say it plainly," he said. "You are every good thing that has happened to me. You and this place and those 3 impossible children. I came up that road looking for water and I found you, and I have been—" He stopped. He found his words. "I have been more myself since you than I have ever been, that's the truth of it." She put her hand over his, the one on her face. "That will do," she said softly. "That will absolutely do." He kissed her there on the porch in the gathering dark, with the desert stars coming one by one into the sky above the farm that was theirs. The farm they had saved and built and filled with children and work, and the patient accumulation of a life that was real and whole and entirely good. Inside, a lamp went on in Thomas's window, and they could hear, faintly, the sound of Eli's wood scrap construction project reaching some kind of loud conclusion, and Margaret slept on in her perfect silence. Vernon sat down on the porch step again, and Ella picked up her cold tea, and they stayed there until the stars had finished gathering and the desert night had gone completely, absolutely, magnificently quiet, and the farm sat still and solid and theirs beneath the wide October sky, and there was nothing left undone, nothing left uncertain, nothing left to ask for or to wait for or to wish had been different. It was exactly what it was. It was more than enough. It was everything.